Episode 340. We still need a regeneration revolution. This is the Change Underground. I'm your host, John. Today's episode is a reworking of episode 226 from way back in 2020. I hope you find it useful, because I found it useful re-going over it. I think it's time we returned again to some more first principles ideas. Decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. Today we're going to discuss in particular regeneration of the soil and ecosystems. Over the past 50 to 75 years, basically since the Second World War, we've gone through a period of destruction. In effect, a Faustian bargain in which we gave up 1% of our topsoil every year in return for production returns. We did this by using chemical fertilisers, pesticides, herbicides and fungicides. And to some extent it worked. There were lots of famine and people starving in the 1970s, and a lot of the techniques developed with chemical inputs saved many people and kept them alive. But the cost? Well, that bill is coming due and we need to pay for it now. If we wait much longer, the cost will be so much higher. A few years back, about 30 say, the idea of sustainability started to kick off, and it was about halting the decline that everyone could see, holding things steady. But even then, that wasn't going to be enough, and it never was. You could even see it then. Being sustainable was great, but it wasn't going to actually improve things, especially as we're growing more people every year. We need to actually do something to improve and save our soils. Regeneration is about returning what has been ripped from the soil by the use of agricultural chemicals. Let's think about it this way. We've been living through a J curve, and we are at the first part of the J. At the bottom of the curve. We're in a position where we can start growing the longer part. Out of everything we've lost, it's what's gone missing from the soil that's most significant. That is carbon. And carbon is just a proxy for life on this planet. Much soil nowadays is just a matrix used to contain the chemicals used to grow the food. In effect, a huge hydroponic system. If you've seen the film King Kong, you know this to be the case, because they pump liquid ammonia into the soil. Liquid ammonia, which is a nitrogen-based product, well, it's nearly all nitrogen to be honest, and gives the corn a bit of a kickle on. Now, this isn't sweet corn nor flour corn, but it's a type called dent corn, which is then treated like crude oil, again, the industrialisation of food. It's chemically fractionated, torn apart, and then fed to stock and people and whatnot. We get wonderful things like high fructose corn syrup and large rates of type 2 diabetes from the process. Really kicked off with the Green Revolution. There was a growing population on the planet, and there was a hell of a lot of nitrogen left over after World War II, because nitrogen is a key part of explosives. The terrifying explosion of ammonium nitrate in Beirut this week is an example of what it can do when used as an explosive. And once the war ended somewhat more quickly than people expected, there was an awful lot of this stuff left over, and the industrial capacity to continue making more. A way was found to use it in conjunction with increased mechanisation as well as extra phosphorus and potassium, because you need the three elements, and the growth in monocultural production just exploded. There was a time in the 60s and 70s when the American farm system went from paying people not to grow crops to paying people to grow extra crops. This was in response to an ideological change, but also the fact that there were so many more people suffering famines. I still remember photo images from the news of thousands upon thousands of people in India living in stormwater drains piled on top of each other to give them some sort of housing and so that they could be fed nearby. The Green Revolution built upon this and selected seeds for hybridisation. All these things interacted to basically kill off the soil. An article I read a little while ago stated the UK probably had somewhat like 60 harvests left before their topsoil is completely gone. The UK has a reputation for reasonably good soil. When we start applying these sorts of industrialised processes to the ancient soils of, say, Australia, you end up with a bigger problem more quickly. We are fortunately on deep red volcanic soil where I am, but even that's not without limits. It's soil that feeds us, that and the fact that it rains from time to time. There seems to be a series of things going on as the soil dries out so that the climate dries too. And we all know climate change is going on, and so that's just exacerbating things. But ever since colonisation and the clearing of forestry here in Australia, there's been a drying out of the continent. The lack of fire stick farming by Europeans has altered the nature of our soils, as did the fire stick farming to start with. There are always consequences for actions. Mechanised farming in the developed world and increasingly across the developing world was the only game in town after the Second World War. All the best and brightest minds went into ways to make the industrial system as efficient as possible. I guess that's fair enough at the time. There were people starving, there was money to be made, there were careers to be created. The end point of that, of course, is not so much an excess of food because there are still people starving, but a waste of food, and on the technological level you end up with something like Monsanto developing seeds that only grow in paddocks sprayed with glyphosate and planted with hybridised seeds that need to be repurchased each year. The seeds are genetically modified to be able to resist the effects of the glyphosate. A quick word about genetically modified crops. Genetic modification is something humans have done to plant seeds since we came into contact with them. We're just another evolutionary pressure on seeds. Now, if you're going to bring a new batch to market, one that's more rust-resistant or better able to account for drought or whatever, I've got no problem using GM techniques. When companies started putting fish genes into tomatoes so that you can grow them in frosts, I have an issue. And then there's Monsanto. The technology which could be used for improving seeds was used to alter them so that the seeds could only work when bathed in glyphosate. And they had the ability to withstand this glyphosate genetically engineered into them. The glyphosate then wiped out all the competing weeds. This is great if that's what you're trying to do. If you don't want anything else growing, and this, in inverted commas, improvement, is where the trouble with Monsanto's GM begins. There are so many things wrong with this that it's not funny. What it means to start with is, every time you spray a wheat crop, you're selecting for those weeds that have the ability to withstand the glyphosate. Not surprisingly, 5 to 10 years after this system was developed, Roundup-resistant weeds, which means that either you have to cultivate more or you have to find an even more potent chemical that is not glyphosate, apply that in a special way anyway. The misuse of genetic modification by Monsanto has done much to destroy the idea that there was some good into genetic modification. In the long term, a lot of the chemicals have really nasty side effects and linger in the environment, despite what they say on the tin. The development is the sort of logical endpoint of industrial agricultural systems. If it's not Monsanto and glyphosate, it'll be another seed/chemical company and another poison. Probably best to stop now. So back to the need for regenerative agriculture. As I said, all the best and brightest minds went into the industrial agricultural method. For the people going into agriculture, it was science about the ideas, and it seemed to be working. People were growing more people were being fed, and famines declined. Now, the trouble with a lot of science is that was taught during this period, and actual soil science, only ever covered the physics and chemistry of soil, things like the pH, how the particles interact with each other and how they behaved under different water regimes and so on. But there was rarely any mention of biology in the soil. After all, we didn't have to worry about that sort of nonsense the chemicals were feeding the world. Enter the hippies. As a reaction to this paradigm, there arose a back to the land movement in the 1960s and 70s. Hippies, communes, that sort of thing. But there were also others like John Seymour and his wonderful book, The Complete Book of Self-Sufficiency, which was where I started my organic journey. Seymour were going back to organics by using systems from prior to the introduction of chemical fertilisers, basically growing without the chemical fertilisers. Yields dropped some to begin with, but so too did costs. You weren't having to buy all the fertilisers and chemicals and whatnot. You were growing your own food through your own farm systems. There was also a fellow called John Jeavons who came up with a similar sort of system, except his didn't involve animals, but did involve a lot of double digging each year in the garden beds. 85% of the stuff that was grown went through the compost to feed the soil for the 10% you ate and the 5% you sold for profit. A lot of these older systems described as new ways of doing things were not, but they were the beginnings of the sustainability movements. The idea we needed to stop what we were doing with chemicals and we need to start saving the soils that we've got. At the same time, people like Masanori Fukuoka of the One Straw Revolution, who didn't use any chemicals, did use animals, ducks. And of course, in the 70s and 80s, we had Bill Mollison on the development of permaculture. So we have to move from industrial to sustainable to regenerative. What commenced as a return to old ways then developed new ways of doing things. It wasn't just in the English-speaking and the Japanese-speaking world. People developed systems in India and Bangladesh as well. There's a system called zero-budget natural farming that was developed in India and does what it says on the tin, using available resources to create biology in the soil. An older system developed in the 19th century, biodynamics, developed by Rudolf Steiner, It involves creating and maintaining soil biology. And biodynamics has been taken up by large numbers of wine growers as a way to improve their soil, their harvests, and the ecosystems that they're growing in. And it is a system that works. A word of explanation, like permaculture, biodynamics has probably got two wings to it. I'll be very blunt here and not judgmental, but you just need to be aware that there are two sides of these things. I've heard these two streams described as being the purple and the brown. The brown wing of biodynamics and permaculture, for that matter, focuses on food production, soil health, and getting things done at a commercial level. The purple side is what could be described as a bit woo-woo, or perhaps described as esoteric, might be a better description, which is fine if you want to do that. I'm not denigrating it, but for those of you reading or coming in contact with biodynamics and or permaculture for the first time, just be aware that it may not resonate with you because of the purple-brown dichotomy. By the way, I'm definitely of the brown variety. We have the regenerative techniques, Fukuoka, zero-budget natural farming, permaculture, biodynamics, and the facts are they work, and the point of them is to get more soil carbon or more soil biology happening. Now, this includes fungal activity, the bacteria, and even soil viruses. There's positive ones as well as negative. The same with the bacteria and the fungus. The point is we can replace all the artificial fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, fungicides with natural systems, complex ecosystems. There is going to be a period of adjustment, but it can be done now, especially as lands are coming out of drought and after fire events or even flooding. Cleanish slate, start as you mean to go on sort of thing. Now, the other thing that happened with industrial agriculture that no one talked about at the time, and I've mentioned before, was the loss of soil carbon. Soil carbon is destroyed every time you plough the soil or turn it over or expose it to air. And it's this aspect that has the climate change implications. As you can imagine, this is a bit of an issue given everything else going on in the industrialised world. The good news is regenerative farming sucks the carbon out of the atmosphere and puts it in the soil. I've heard calculations on this that are quite mind-boggling. Originally, I heard a 3% increase in soil carbon across the soils of Australia will remove all the carbon put into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution, which seems a bit excessive to me, but they've done their maths. The latest thinking is that 2/3 of the world's agricultural land and increasing its soil carbon by about 2% will remove all the excess carbon since 1750 or thereabouts, and it'll do it in 2 to 5 years, depending on weather conditions and that sort of thing. We can actually make a difference within that time. Now, the IPC a couple of years ago said we had 12 years to go, so we're probably down to about 10 now before we need to get these things bedded in. So if we get things happening in 2 to 5 years, we really should get to it. So we're in a position where we can actually reverse all of climate change. Well, all of the carbon dioxide related to climate change. The methane and whatnot being released in the tundra is problematic, but we can do this carbon thing in the soil, and we need to do it probably quicker rather than slower. So a quick word about the benefits of regenerative agriculture, regenerative gardening, and even a regenerative approach to life. In regards to the soil, regenerative agriculture and gardening has many benefits other than just the climate ones. By removing all the chemical inputs, we give the soil a chance to heal. We produce food that returns to the nutrient levels of the 19th and early 20th century. Protein levels were much higher. Once the soil's been cleaned, then water becomes clean because it's not getting the rubbish going into it or the chemicals. Natural systems have a chance to repair themselves. The beneficial organisms aren't being killed off by constantly being doused in chemical inputs. When the water's clean and the soil's clean, the air follows, provided we keep a handle on industrial outputs for other things. So I think we can do this. The evidence is quite clear. We all know what needs to be done. It's just a matter of everyone doing it. So I'd call upon us all to do that. Put the groundwork in now, we can all change the world, even if it's only a little bit to start with, and we will begin the process of decarbonising the air and recarbonising the soil. Thanks you all for listening, and I'll be back next week.